very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak. When I was thinking about the paper, I didn't really take long to realise that I could draw on some of the work that I've done fairly recently on Herbert Reed. I hope not everyone who gets invited to speak about modernism here in Leeds invokes Reed, but I'm sure it's happened in the past. So this, as Chris says, is part of a kind of broader ongoing project on abstraction. Abstraction as a critical concept as well as a concept within the visual arts, and it's a study that tries to bring those things together. There's a chapter on Reed which I'm drawing a little bit on today into that, but obviously Reed's so important here. For those of you who may not know, a crucial figure for Leeds, and Leeds was crucial for Reed as well. He studied law and economics here before the First World War, but then of course the main context I think for Leeds' importance is the amazing Leeds Arts Club and the effect that had on the reception of modernism, and especially abstract modernism within Britain from 1903, when it was first established by A.R. Orridge and Holbrook Jackson, and then later in 1913 when it was taken up by Frank Rutter and Michael Sadler, very, very strongly pioneering the idea and the practice of abstract art, abstract painting, and that's the context, really. That's one of the contexts in which I want to talk about Herbert Reed today. And also I've just discovered as well, this literally in the last couple of days, that there is also the Herbert Reed archive, of course, in the special collections edition in the University Library of 14,000 volumes from Reed's collection. So it's of some significance. I've also opted for the ancient technology of a printed handout there. See there, just to say that I can do PowerPoints. I'm completely reliant on them for my teaching, but I thought we would take a different approach today, and you can take the quotations away. So I will try to flag up the quotations as I approach them, starting from the first. It is the first day of June, 1942. The laburnum trees cast their golden rain against a hedge of vivid beech leaves. Everything is fresh and sweet in the cool, early sunshine. I have just heard that over the weekend, the biggest air raid in history has taken place. With this reference to the British RAF bombing of Cologne, Herbert Reed opens movingly the concluding chapter of Education Through Art, a book that was to remain well known and influential in British schools at arts policy and practice from its publication up to the relatively recent past. The title of the chapter is The Necessary Revolution, and the sensory present, it seems, is the necessary medium for the attempt to begin to make sense of this, the devastating firebombing of the German city, along with concurrent events in other theatres of war cited by Reed. The fight to a standstill of two immense armies in Ukraine, and the fury of mutual destruction of armoured vehicles in the Libyan desert. So, Reed writes, I listen half-consciously to the sounds that reach me here, to the twittering of birds and the voices of children playing in the garden, and try to realise the meaning of these distant events. Such events are the vacillating background, as he puts it, against which Reed has written Education Through Art. And he continues, and this is number 2 on the handout. I have been reminding the reader of the importance of sensation in an age which practices brutalities and recommends ideals. And I've built up a theory which attempts to show that if, in the upbringing of our children, we preserve by methods which I have indicated the vividness of their sensations, we might succeed in relating action to feeling, and even reality to our ideals. Idealism would then no longer be an escape from reality, it would be a simple human response to reality. The importance of sensation in an age which practices brutalities and recommends ideals. Reed's quotation is from E.M. Forster's 1941 Reed lecture, that's R-E-D-E, lecture on Virginia Woolf, published only the previous month, May 1942. and first delivered by Forster in Cambridge on the 29th of May 1941, just 2 months after his friend Virginia Woolf's death on the 28th of March of that year. Forster in his lecture sees this reminder of the importance of sensation as the essence of our debt to Woolf, and he records it at this point in his lecture with particular reference to the sense of taste, or more precisely to eating, along the lines of what he calls Woolf's own enlightened greediness. Compared to the lack of any savour in the fictional dishes of Henry James, Forster argues that, and I quote, "When Virginia Woolf mentions nice things, they get right into our mouths, so far as the edibility of print permits. We taste their deliciousness." The beurre fondue from Mrs. Ramsay's dinner party is invoked by Forster, by way of demonstration that food was not for Woolf a literary device put in to make the book seem real. And he continues, and this is number 3, "She put it in because she tasted it, because she saw pictures, because she smelt flowers, because she heard bark, because her senses were both exquisite and Catholic, and were always bringing her first-hand news of the outside world." Earlier in the lecture, Forster had tried harder to reflect upon the passage between this sensory awareness and the generation of a text by characterising the intensity of Woolf's liking for writing. While the process is one of receiving sensations and then, as Forster writes, passing them through her mind where they encountered theories and memories, and then bringing them out again through a pen onto a bit of paper, the end result, complex and intellectual and large and heavy with facts though it might be, returns to or becomes the analogue of the sensations with which it began. Forster writes, "It was not about something, it was something." So that even a discursive text, such as Woolf's essay on Roger Fry, emerges for Forster from a notion of musical composition. The biography is not just about Fry, but, Forster writes, "It is something else too. It is one thing, one." It's a very strange locution. That's not on your handout, but a very strange locution at the end of that sentence where Forster is trying to characterise that sense of what we recognise as a work of modernist autonomy. Forster then arrives at this familiar definition of modernism in the terms of formal autonomy. We think of Samuel Beckett in 1929 on Finnegan's Wake. Here form is content, content is form. His writing is not about something, it is that something itself. Or we might think about Clement Greenberg's later propositions about the modernist arts, independently refining their techniques and so on. And in this, we glimpse, I think, perhaps, more of what drew Herbert Reed to Forster's lecture. Over an immensely productive career, Reed published a succession of books on the primary importance of aesthetic education. And if we were being unkind to Reed, it might be said that this process involved, in a way, writing the same book over and over again. What I mean here is that Reed ceaselessly took upon himself, each time starting fresh as it were, the task of narrating the story of the emergence of modernist art. For an implied readership not, we sense, necessarily blessed with the exquisite or attuned, educated sensorium that Virginia Woolf benefited from, a common readership, if you like. And one more precise but still recurrent feature of that narrative, appearing as if a kind of limit case or test of the educational task that Reed had set himself, was the attempt to explain or account for abstraction in painterly and sculptural modernism. So Reed returns to that business, that job, of explaining what modernism is, what abstraction is, and what it's about, again and again. Aesthetic education for Reed was not just the cornerstone of a sensitive and progressive society, but of a revolutionary or revolutionized society. Remember the title of that chapter, The Necessary Revolution. And abstraction had a crucial role to play in this narrative, as was evident, for example, in the activist context of his 1935 address to the Artists' International Association in London. Reed there defined abstraction as the art of the future, the art of a classless society, and he insisted in an unmistakably Platonic spirit, that abstraction, and I quote, kept inviolate until such time as society will once more be ready to make use of them, the universal qualities of art. The current intermediary or transitional state then, in that state, abstract artists were perfecting their formal sensibility, said Reid, before being called upon to take up the great work of reconstruction. Before thinking further then about this relation between sensation and abstraction, I want to return, however, to my starting point, to Herbert Reed, the pacifist, rather than the modernist, and to reconsider, through a different optic, the coupling of war and sensation. D.H. Lawrence's dismay at the outbreak of war in 1914 led him, out of sheer rage, in 1915, to the drafting of his first long philosophical essay, The Study of Thomas Hardy, a work, as Lawrence acknowledged, about just about everything else but Thomas Hardy. The essay opens with a long complaint along Bergsonian lines about an overriding modern logic and ethic of self-preservation, at once scientific and monetary. Through this logic, a flower and its sensory impact, a flower such as the poppy, a red flame licking into sight, a red splash in the world, has attributed to it the inferior status of the excess that accompanies reproduction. Human beings then, hidebound by this logic and detained at the stage of the cabbage, we were all cabbages for Lawrence, hidebound in that way then, it is, Lawrence declaims, no wonder there is a war, and this is quotation 4 in your handout. No wonder there's a war, no wonder there's a great waste and squandering of life, anything to prove that we're not altogether sealed in our own self-preservation as dying chrysalids. Better the light be blown out willfully, recklessly in the wildest wind than remain secure under the bushel, saved from every draught. So we go to war to show that we can throw our lives away. Indeed, they have become of so little value to us. We cannot live, we cannot be. Then let us tip-cat with death, let us rush throwing our lives away. Then at any rate we shall have a sensation. And perhaps, after all, the value of life is in death. For Reid then, as we've seen, the importance of sensation is to insert itself as a mode of real and vivid feeling between the brutality of modern warfare and its origin in mistaken ideals or mistaken idealism. For Lawrence, war is the only means by which men and women, hidebound by their ideals, can avail themselves of sensation. While we might read this as a kind of depoliticizing perversity on Lawrence's part, or more particularly as an early configuration of the death drive, it involves, for example, thanking Germany for having the power to burst the hide of the cabbage. I also want to try to read this, in a way, in the spirit in which Lawrence intended it, that is, like Reid, in a spirit of pacifism. Bitterness and exasperation lead Lawrence to welcome the war we know he abhors. How can we be at peace when, as sensation deniers, we plainly hate ourselves so much? Tell me no more we care about human life and suffering, he rails. We are, every one of us, revelling at this moment in the squandering of human life as if it was something we needed, and it is shameful. This is the voice then of a man ashamed at how little human life is valued. But it's also, however, as I want to try to suggest, the voice of a writer wondering about the adequacy of conventional discourses of the human to this very goal of the valuation of human life, that is, to the avoidance of that humanistic idealism that had generated war and its unthinkable brutality in the first place. Between 1912 and 1914, living and travelling in continental Europe for the first time, Lawrence had been developing a theory of the senses through a geographical and cultural encounter with Italy in particular. In the essays that were to become the collection Twilight in Italy, he tried out a schema that was to be extended into the study of Thomas Hardy, and which we now recognise as a version of the modernist theory of dissociation of sensibility. Lawrence sees the rise of European Christianity since the Middle Ages as, and I quote, a striving out of a strong primitive animal nature towards the self-abnegation and the abstraction of Christ. These polarities at work in Lawrence's thinking are variously characterized: Mosaic and Christian, flesh and word, God which is me and God which is not me, and as the relation between the senses and the mind. In Michelangelo, however, there is a movement back to the flesh, which constitutes for Lawrence, as he puts it, the Italian position ever since. And this is what he says: the mind, that is the light; the senses, they are the darkness. So he writes thus of the Italian supremacy of the senses. And this is number 5 on the handout. There is the I, always the I, and the mind is submerged, overcome. But the senses are superbly arrogant. The senses are absolute, the godlike, for I can never have another man's senses. These are me, my senses absolutely me, and all that is can only come to me through my senses. But through the figure of Aphrodite and Aphrodite worship, there is a further and important qualification to be made by Lawrence. At the same time as the senses become supreme, they also become self-conscious, or conscious of being an aim unto themselves. They know their aim, writes Lawrence. Their aim is in supreme sensation. They seek the maximum of sensation. Such a qualified sensuality is surely evident, I think, in that other side to Twilight in Italy, in which Lawrence vividly narrates his experiences of travel in Italy and his encounters with Italians. No sooner have I committed that word vividly, Lawrence vividly narrates his experiences, and I'm thinking here obviously of Reed's emphasis on vividness of sensations, then I realise the quality of the cliche in a way that clings to that in Lawrence, in the kind of field of Lawrence criticism. It draws on the myth of the intensely life-affirming vitalist Lawrence, whose aesthetic, based on acts of attention, was able to evoke the spirit of place more potently than most. I think we're familiar with that conventional discourse on Lawrence. In fact, in Twilight in Italy, when we look at Twilight in Italy, we find a mode of sensory awareness often noticeably removed from the delivery of the first-hand news of the outside world that Forster found in Woolf, far less alive and interested in its surrounding stimuli than we might expect. Lawrence's own senses seem a curiously erratic affair, flickering on and off like an unreliable light bulb. If you're wondering about my metaphor there, I think I did also, it's somewhere behind that, I think. There is that sense that a number of us have mentioned in the conference so far, a notion of the technological mediation, Sarah Danius and Tim Armstrong conception of the technological mediation of the senses, which I think is already at work in Lawrence, in his descriptions in Twilight in Italy. In the careful self-monitoring of experience that makes up his narration, a recurrent structure is for Lawrence to start or be startled into consciousness out of what is described as an everyday trance. So in the opening essay, The Crucifix Across the Mountains, as he walks in the South Tyrol from Germany to Italy, Lawrence writes that one scarcely notices the roadside shrines whose crucifixes he nevertheless describes as genuine expressions of the people's soul. Perhaps, he continues, one's interest is dead. He must then be startled into consciousness one evening by the first crucifix described, or later, entering a Baroque-style chapel, he finds, and I quote, the most startlingly sensational Christus I have ever seen. Or, in the essay The Spinner and the Monks, he writes of the church perched above the village of San Tommaso, and this is number 6 on the handout. I saw it often, and yet for a long time it never occurred to me that it actually existed. It was like a vision, a thing one does not expect to come close to. For a long time I knew how the day went by, the imperious clangour of midday and evening bells striking down upon the houses on the edge of the lake, yet it did not occur to me to ask where these bells rang. Till at last my everyday trance was broken in upon, and I knew the ringing of the church of San Tommaso. The church became a living connection with me. Here is an uncertain relation, then, between senses and cognition, in which the word "new" slides from the simple registration of the time of day to the integrated living connection of "I knew the ringing of the church of San Tommaso." It takes entry into the darkness of the church itself, a darkness loaded, of course, physically and metaphysically, For Lawrence, it seems at least to approach momentarily that Italian position he elsewhere characterizes, and this is number 7. I went into the church. It was very dark and impregnated with centuries of incense. It affected me like the lair of some enormous creature. My senses were roused. They sprang awake in the hot, spiced darkness. My skin was expectant, as if it expected some contact, as if it were aware of the contiguity of the physical world, the physical contact with the darkness and the heavy, suggestive substance of the enclosure. It was a fierce darkness of the senses, but my soul shrank. The shrinking of the soul reminds us of that hesitation or flickering or perhaps deadness of interest that Lawrence knows marks him out as a modern. The onward march of consciousness makes sensual awareness more fugitive for Lawrence, less available to us. And even in the Italian, we remember, the senses themselves became self-conscious. In his use of soul here, the word soul, as in Pound's cautions about Western soul obsession, what Lawrence is really looking for is something closer to the concept of ego, a consciousness of self as other, which is also always a heightened awareness of what one is feeling at any moment. I, always the I, of the older dispensation differs in that this is a condition, the latter is a condition of total envelopment. The I is all because it knows of no ideational separation. Hence, Lawrence's description of the Bavarian peasant as a hot welter of physical sensation, which we should know as something fundamentally other even than the sudden and momentary springing awake of the Laurentian sensorium in the dark church of San Tommaso. I highlight the term ego here, though, to indicate that there is in Lawrence's thinking at this time something else going on other than the retrospective location of sensation in the pre-modern history of Southern Europe. Italy for Lawrence at this time also meant a relation to the future through his reading in 1914 and during the composition of The Rainbow of futurist manifestos. And here I want to approach very briefly that staple item in the Lawrence canon, really, and that's the letter of the 5th of June 1914 to his editor, Edward Garnett, which is very well known. In this letter, Lawrence tentatively yet forcefully projected the experimental nature of his own fiction in terms of the tracing of what he called another ego. Lawrence is disappointed with Garnett's criticisms of the psychology of early drafts of The Rainbow because they seem to require that old-fashioned human element, as he calls it, by which a character must be consistent enough to fit within a certain moral scheme, even though such a scheme is in itself, as Lawrence puts it, dull, old, and dead. Picking up Marinetti's conception of an intuitive physiology of matter, which he admits he doesn't understand, Lawrence declares that, and I quote, that which is physic, non-human, in humanity, is more interesting to me than the old-fashioned human element. And he continues, and this is number 8 on the handout, and I do apologise if this is wearily familiar to some of you. I don't so much care about what the woman feels in the ordinary usage of the word. That presumes an ego to feel with. I only care about what the woman is, what she is inhumanly, physiologically, materially, according to the use of the word. But for me, what she is as a phenomenon, or as representing some greater inhuman will, instead of what she feels according to the human conception. You mustn't look in my novel for the old stable ego of the character. There's another ego, according to whose action the individual is unrecognizable and passes through, as it were, allotropic states, which it needs a deeper sense that we've been used to exercise to discover are states of the same single, radically unchanged element. Again, I say, don't look for the development of the novel to follow the lines of certain characters. The characters fall into the form of some other rhythmic form, like when one draws a fiddle bow across a tray delicately sanded. The sand takes lines unknown. Today I want to suggest 2 things about this familiar material. First, that this inhuman human subject might be thought alongside, in other words, as a comparable model to the plenitude of the sensorium that Lawrence located in the pre-modern Italian position. Therefore, this inhuman is both prior to and moving beyond, as Lawrence saw, the implications of the ego. And second, that the form this urgently needed modern conception of the inhuman should take is that of abstraction. The preeminence of the allotropic state over the individual as the expression of one common element, and the unknown rhythmic form of the lines traced on the sanded tray as a kind of visual space. From this reading, then, I want to draw together some reflections in the second half of my talk on the relations between sensation, abstraction, and the inhuman in certain modernist approaches to aesthetic education, or the education of the senses, in a way that takes us back to Herbert Reed's educational project. So really, this is a kind of buried title of the paper, which is essentially on the abstraction and the inhuman. But I decided not to title the paper that. It might have been a tumbleweed moment, a terrible, cold, desolate wind blows across the continent. Oh no, he's talking about the inhuman and abstraction. So you've got sensation and the senses instead. Really, this is a subtext. Okay. Lawrence is not, of course, known for any overt endorsement of painterly abstraction. We're far more likely to locate in his work that critique of abstraction as an intellectual, operational tool that we've already glimpsed in Twilight in Italy, the abstraction of Christ, for example, as an elimination of the flesh. His most sustained engagement with modernist painting is his commentary on the work of Cézanne, Paul Cézanne, in the late long essay Introduction to These Paintings, 1928. And where we find Cézanne read in terms which are directly reminiscent of what Lawrence had found in futurist abstraction some 14 years earlier. Cézanne, he asserts, is the first painter in centuries to rupture the established pattern of fear and evasion of the body by acknowledging, and I quote, that matter actually exists. This heroic effort is characterized by Lawrence as a lifelong struggle to break or overcome the cliché on Cézanne's part, that is, the cliché of realist illusionism. And Cézanne is held to succeed in this case, in only a very few paintings of apples and a jug or two. If this is again a materialism, then as in the account of futurism, an attempt is made to dissociate it from base or reductive versions of subject-object relations. So while Lawrence had asserted of the futurists, for example, that they were stupid to expect the phenomena of physics to be found in human beings, rather than a new human phenomenon, as he put it, he also found Cézanne's revolution to be, and I quote, neither optical, nor mechanical, nor intellectual. But those negations, I think, are interesting. In what sense, then, is this revolution through which the material reality of appliness, Lawrence said, in Cézanne hurts its viewers? In what sense might this revolution be a case of abstraction? What I think we see in Lawrence is a kind of familiar tension in the discourses around abstraction. He is pulled towards the notion of abstract art, yet is unable to name abstraction except in the form of a reproach towards modernity. And what I think we do see in this is a condition of the ceaselessly contradictory work undertaken by the concept of abstraction itself. In the case of artistic abstraction, then, Lawrence's writing could be situated within a century-wide field of debate, within which the idea of abstract painting alternates between, on the one hand, the intellectual generalization of sensory experience, and on the other, a more authentic embodiment of the sensory, or of sensation, than previous representational conventions had been able to attain. And it seems to me that the field of debate on abstraction is ceaselessly moving between those two alternatives. This is clearly not the place to reflect on those today, but it is instructive, however, to look at how this contradictory work might have played out in Herbert Reed's embrace of modernist abstraction, remembering how crucial it was for Reed, and in contrast to Lawrence, to explain to his reader what abstraction was about. And this in an age which not only needed to be reminded of the importance of sensation, but in which, as he argues in that same final chapter of Education Through Art, insensibility is a pervasive and endemic disease of the human spirit, comparable to the blights of war and poverty. So I want to draw here now from the essays in Reed's 1952 collection, The Philosophy of Modern Art. And this is number 9 on the handout, 9A to C, where we find abstraction defined initially as, at 9a, what is derived or disengaged from nature, the pure or essential form abstracted from the concrete details. So far, so predictable then, perhaps. But what I'm more interested in is the way in which abstraction might prise open and occupy the space between the two statements that follow. That's 9b and 9c. Art is an organic phenomenon, a biological process. Like flowers and fruit, plumage and song, it is a product of the life force itself. That's from the essay The Fate of Modern Painting, which is a lecture that Reid gave to UNESCO in 1952. And then, following that, the artist paints what he wants to see, a human or individual version of that inhuman abstraction called nature. And that's from the essay Human Art and Inhuman Nature. So, if art is organic, biological, and therefore, as Reid continually insisted, a uniquely human part of natural evolutionary process, nature itself needs to be seen also as inhuman and abstract. The human exists within that inhuman abstraction, so that art, including modern abstract art, is a product of a life force, as Reid puts it, expressed in and through humans. In each of these essays, Reid uses and insists upon the phrase, art is human, as it seems the necessary expression of his commitment, profound commitment, to sensation, to the education of the senses, as an antidote to barbarism. Yet the human is simultaneously the material, the inhuman, so that even in painting what he or she wants to see, the artist, an impersonal process, is fulfilling itself in the artist. Humanist perspectives then require for their completion an embrace or understanding of the inhuman. Aesthetic education for Reid must at some level incorporate this dehumanizing impulse, or let us say, an acknowledgement of what the inhuman is and what it might mean. Any humanist perspective is incomplete without such an understanding of the inhuman. Humanism cannot be entirely trusted to deliver to us a full sense of what it is to be alive as humans and to value such life fully. What it has delivered instead, as both Reid and Lawrence agree, is the brutality of war under the guise of humanistic ideals. The key role of abstraction in this for Reid is surely derived, at least in part, from Wilhelm Worringer, who Reid acknowledges as his esteemed master in the philosophy of art. In Abstraction and Empathy, 1908, Worringer argued for a causal connection between the abstractions of primitive, so-called primitive, and advanced modernist art, both of which find beauty in, as Worringer puts it, the life-denying inorganic, in the crystalline, or in general terms, in all abstract art and necessity. Located between these instances then, as it were, is the reign of empathy for Worringer, and, implicit in this, the period of what Michel Foucault called the invention of the human, the humanistic human. And I think which is associated for Worringer with the value of the organic and with the idealization of natural beauty, and, as he puts it, I think rather tongue-in-cheek, the happy pantheistic relationship of confidence between man and the phenomena of the external world. Worringer's critique is not only that this supremacy of organicism is a form of cultural imperialism, leaving us ill-equipped or even helpless to comprehend the art of the more distant past and non-Western cultures, but also that it involves a fundamental misconception of the status of the work of art vis-à-vis nature. What abstraction instead demonstrates, as Worringer puts it, is that the work of art, and this is number 10 on a handout, as an autonomous organism, stands beside nature on equal terms. It is, in its deepest and innermost essence, devoid of any connection with it, insofar as by nature is understood the visible surface of things. Natural beauty is on no account to be regarded as a condition of the work of art, despite the fact that in the course of evolution it seems to have become a valuable element in the work of art, and to some extent indeed positively identical with it. Perhaps this helps to explain what Reid meant in saying in his own work on Cézanne that Cézanne's stated goal of realizing his sensations had restored a primal rectitude to painting. Reid argues that retaining the presentational immediacy of sense perceptions is the most difficult of tasks for the artist, habituated as we all are to translating the coloured shape in front of us into the linguistic symbol or concept of a chair. Perhaps an artist might not have jumped to the notion of a chair. Reid borrows this phrase and the idea of presentational immediacy from A.N. Whitehead, of whom more in a moment. So artistic abstraction is aligned with such sensory immediacy here, as if to counteract the intellectual abstraction that always threatens to impose itself in the process, just as Voringer argues that the primitive urge to abstract regularity of form prevailed when, I quote, intellect had not yet dimmed instinct. In Reid and Voringer, then, what we see, of course, is an apparent displacement or a parenthesizing of human sensibility, which has told against abstraction in certain respects, in certain key respects. At the extreme end of this spectrum, for example, there is Paul Virilio's recent work, Christian Humanist Polemics, on what Virilio calls an aesthetics of disappearance, in, for example, his book Art and Fear, 2003. And Virilio argues that, once the non-representationalism of abstraction is construed as an eradication of the human, the strategies of abstract art can then be directly aligned with those of genocide. Reading Herbert Reed and his patient, recursive expositions of modernist abstraction reveals the grotesque inappropriateness of such arguments as Virilio's. For Reed, abstraction was not a mode of erasure or absence at all, but a newly exploratory approach to the position of the human within the inhuman. For Reed and for Lawrence, then, we must somehow learn through the offices of abstraction why the inhuman might be important, or through the offices of the inhuman, why abstraction might be important. If this looks and feels like an act of distancing, in the light of Voringer's sense of the work of art as an autonomous organism, pushing the artwork away from a humanism that threatens to stifle it with the criteria of representationalism or natural beauty, then the extension, I suggest, or the legacy of this modernism has been the move by which sensation comes to belong to the artwork itself. As Peter de Bolle puts it, this is sensation, a version of sensation, without the agency we commonly assume to have the sensation, that is, sensation cut loose from the senses and hence inhuman. De Bolle's reference point here, obviously, is the work of Gilles Deleuze, and he's writing in particular about Deleuze's book on Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, though the most direct expression of this most radical view of sensation comes in Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy? In a kind of extreme version of Death of the Author theory for visual culture, though not one that would have been alien to the Roland Barthes of Camera Lucida, I think, Deleuze and Guattari maintain that art preserves and is not dependent on its source after completion. The air in a photograph or painting no longer depends on whoever was breathing it that morning. The work of art, they claim, is a block of sensations, that is to say, a compound of percepts and affects, none of which in this context belong to a human subject, despite the reinvention of those terms in order precisely to reapproach the nature of imaginative work and production. Sensations, percepts, affects are, Deleuze and Guattari write, beings whose validity lies in themselves and exceeds any lived. And you can see the clear connection there, that notion of the artwork as a being with its own validity, with Voringer's notion of the autonomous organism. Deleuze's work on Francis Bacon of a decade earlier is more like a gradual approach to this position on sensation, by seeming to set itself the task of accounting for a remark by Bacon from his interviews with David Sylvester. And this is number 11, short quotation on your handout. This is Francis Bacon. It is a very, very close and difficult thing to know why some paint comes across directly onto the nervous system and other paint tells you the story in a long diatribe through the brain. Deleuze tackles this by setting up a close parallel between Bacon and Cézanne, that is, by linking Cézanne's imperative paint the sensation, as that is translated, with Bacon's record the fact. And in fact, Deleuze also sees Cézanne's achievement in respect of sensation as lying in what Lawrence calls the aptliness of of the apple. Lawrence's reading of Cézanne is very important, as I'm sure you know, to Deleuze. This sensation then is a fused complex of subject and object with no face, a condition of being in the world such that, as Deleuze writes, as a spectator, I experience the sensation only by entering the painting, by reaching the unity of the sensing and the sense. The painting does not represent the body, but is the thing that sustains the sensation of the body, and hence the possibility of experiencing it by presenting. Bacon achieves this, says Deleuze, through the distinctive Baconian figure, where this differs both from the figurative and from what Deleuze defines as abstraction, because both of the latter, the figurative and the abstraction, pass through the brain, as Deleuze says. We might think here then of the apparent disfiguration of the faces in Bacon's paintings turns them into flesh and suggests a play of forces in and of the body, rather than representation. And I think this points up, Deleuze's reading points up the limitations of John Berger's two readings of Bacon, much though I admire Berger as a critic, but Berger continued to see Bacon's work, saw the paintings as encoding or allegorizing a condition of human suffering and modern alienation. I think that's really not, at least through Deleuze, not what Bacon is about. Sensation in this encounter with Bacon's work is not feeling, but affect. So, beginning to conclude, what might be the significance of the migration I have traced from sensation as a ground of human aesthetic sensitivity or sensibility to sensation externalized in the artwork itself and going beyond, as Deleuze puts it, going beyond lived experience? One conclusion might be that despite Herbert Reed's best efforts, we are still struggling to find a language to register and think about abstract art. Only such a conclusion could explain the appearance in 2001 of Peter de Bolle's book, Art Matters. I've already mentioned de Bolle's writing on Deleuze. In this singular text, then, Art Matters, published in 2001, de Bolle feels able to wonder aloud and in a disarmingly personal and emotional way about aesthetic experience and the lack of an adequate affective language for embodying it. Is being struck dumb before a work of art a condition of the wonder that art generates, or of this inadequacy of language? If we ask how much one needs to know in order to appreciate the effect a work of art has on us, how far does this intellectualization, as de Bolle calls it, at the same time block or prevent one from seeing, hearing, or reading? That's de Bolle again. The position de Bolle arrives at, however, in his chapter of response to Barnett Newman's abstract strip painting of 1951, Via Heroicus Sublimis, is that we must ask instead the question, what does this painting know? What is its way of knowing? Another admission, it seems, of the necessity of uncoupling sensation from merely subjective response. For writers like Lawrence and Herbert Reed, modernist experimentalism and abstraction seem to intensify an awareness of a woeful lack of aesthetic intelligence in the population at large. Lawrence complained about the modern Englishman standing in front of a painting with a few borrowed ideas, not knowing what to feel. This is quoting from Lawrence. We know we ought to feel something, but what? Oh, tell us what. Despite the contrastingly patient, educative tone of Reed's whole project, he could be equally unforgiving about what happens when the ordinary citizen enters an art gallery. And quotation 12 on your handout is, I need to kind of read a part of that first. Quotation 12 is an example of Reed trying to imagine, claiming to imagine the experience of that ordinary citizen in the art gallery. When we visit some national or municipal art gallery and observe the people about us, those dim bored figures gingerly skating over waxed floors, drifting like chilled bees from one fading flower to another, can we believe that anything important is happening to them? Just to pause there, as is common in such cases, the response of the common man is supplied for him by Reed. That man, he says, is already deaf to the art around him. He may have acquired the patter of appreciation, the accent of understanding, but, and I return to the quotation here, after the ellipsis there, his aesthetic sensibility has been killed at school, probably before the age of 12. Do not let us deceive ourselves. The common man, such as we produce in our civilization, is aesthetically a dead man. So, the similarities between Lawrence and Reid here are surely not accidental. Reid was, as we know, a great admirer of Lawrence, and in his more affirmative educational proposals in this same essay, he'd not been afraid to echo or even mimic the Lawrence's closely connected educational essays written between 1918 and 1921. These were Education of the People, a long essay which Lawrence published in the TES, I think, or the Times Literary Supplement, and Fantasia of the Unconscious, both of which outline a kind of educational prospectus, really, of Lawrence's part. Reid, as I say, echoed or mimicked Lawrence in calling for what he calls some native aesthetic sensibility to be preserved in children, not to have them, and I quote again, brutalized and anesthetized by the bludgeoning process of learning, that is to say, hammering conceptual knowledge into their innocent minds. You can't make the silk purses of art out of the sow's ears of school certificates. These sentiments are strongly reminiscent of Lawrence's critique of a system of education whose alleged barbarism lay in the premature stimulation of mental consciousness, the proposed solution being for no school education to take place before the age of 10, and no conceptual education before 14. Children should be taught only to move, to act, to do, Lawrence said, before the age of 14. In other words, we're looking here then at Lawrence's and that eccentric, you might say, eccentric view that education was for Lawrence, that the whole function of education was to guard against the development of mental consciousness. Good old Lawrence. What would he do without it? But I hope I've suggested that Lawrence and Reid were trying to ask also more searching questions, and questions that are still searching about aesthetic education and about the nature of sensation. And these questions are concerned not simply with an education about art, but about the philosophical structures of humanism that might need to be rethought, dismantled, in order for a sense of the inhuman to make its necessary, paradoxically humanizing impact upon our thinking about art, about abstraction in particular, through abstraction in particular. Returning then to Reid's Necessary Revolution, I want to suggest that a more meaningful parallel might be with another final chapter, and that is of A.N. Whitehead's very influential text, Science and the Modern World, which is, was based on his Lower Lectures of 1925 at Cambridge. And this is a final chapter that is entitled, in a way I think which echoes interestingly Reid's Necessary Revolution, it's entitled Requisites for Social Progress. As I've already indicated, Reid was also familiar with Whitehead's work and had written about him in the New Age since the early 1920s. On the nature of education, the resonances of Whitehead's chapter with Reid and Lawrence are again very clear. Whitehead writes, "My own criticism of our traditional educational methods is that they are far too much occupied with intellectual analysis and with the acquirement of formularized information." Whitehead's requisite then for social progress is aesthetic education. Yet this is in a form relatively devoid of any appeal to what it is to be human or its value as such, about which his writing appears distinctly uninterested. And in that sense, of course, Whitehead is very different to Lawrence and Reid. Here instead is Whitehead on what follows from the commonly acknowledged evils of the early industrial system. And this is quotation 30 on the handout, final quotation handout. The point which I am insisting on is the stone-blind eye with which even the best men of that time regarded the importance of aesthetics in a nation's life. I do not believe that we have as yet nearly achieved the right estimate. The contributory cause of substantial efficacy to produce this disastrous error was the scientific creed that matter in motion is the one concrete reality in nature, so that aesthetic values form an adventitious addition. Whitehead's embrace of the aesthetic, then, is primarily epistemological, and I think in many ways this connects up with, Richard, you mentioned yesterday Steve Connor's article on Michel Serres, which I haven't read, but it seems to me that Serres, that Whitehead as a kind of precursor of Serres, in some ways is making the same point, that we need to turn to aesthetics for epistemological reasons. Science in the Modern World, one of Whitehead's central and most popular texts, although Isabel Stengers calls it a strange book. At the centre of Science in the Modern World is Whitehead's critique of what he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This fallacy of the scientific revolutionary period was the idea of the simple location of matter in space, producing the distinctly unsensory concept of nature as, and I quote Whitehead, a dull affair, soundless, scentless, colourless, merely the hurrying of material, endlessly, meaninglessly. Whitehead marvels at the way in which this reductive abstraction, a kind of trick, I think Whitehead feels, marvels at the way this was pulled off in the period of the scientific revolution, and had gained and continued to exercise its hold as the very definition of common sense. Yet abstraction per se, the fact that he describes this as a reductive abstraction, the idea of a simple location of matter in space. Abstraction itself is not the issue for Whitehead. The nature of abstraction was a key reference point in his philosophy, and he continually insisted that as thought cannot take place without abstractions, we must be continually vigilant about the abstractions we use and about the danger of misrecognizing them as concrete fact. We could be bold here and suggest that for Whitehead the simple location of matter in space was just plain wrong, and then immediately cover our tracks by saying that it was an inadequate abstraction for him. What must replace it then was the kind of abstraction implicit in art, or rather in habits of aesthetic appreciation, as he put it, which are epistemologically superior, bring us closer to the world, to the extent that art itself is only a special example of this general sense of the aesthetic. As Herbert Reed knew, underpinning this endorsement of aesthetic education in Whitehead was a whole developed philosophy of process, predicated as in the concept of prehension, Whitehead's concept of prehension, on the disturbance of the subject-object relation and logic, and on the unembarrassed attribution of a language of emotions, senses, and cognition to the so-called, or previously called, inanimate world of matter. Effects in prehension are not only the result of their causes, but have a kind of incalculable autonomy or even precedence over them, prehending those causes in taking up and responding to them. While this might look like anthropocentrism, it would claim for itself the opposite. Sensation and cognition are no longer the exclusive preserve of the human, but are shared and partaken in as the mode of our immersion in and belonging to the inhuman. In the same way, sensation or sensory knowledge, apparently externalized in the artwork, frees aesthetics from the tastes or feelings of the human subject, opening up a more philosophically alert world in which the sensory experiences and perceptions of the once-object world dwarf the merely human processes of cognition. Perhaps this is what Herbert Reed was gesturing towards, in the hope that preserving the vividness of our sensations might generate an alternative idealism grounded in the reality of human response. An idealism or mode of abstraction in Whitehead's terms that might allow us, through art, to think together the human and the inhuman, and thereby address the divisions that ceaselessly lead the merely human world into war. Thank you.